Hi, I'm Kate from Zen Stitching, and I'm here with you today to share a really fun way of making something that can be reused. It's upcyclable and a great way to practice your Sashiko stitches. So what I have here is something that once upon a time was a shirt. And what I've done is we've sewn up the buttons together, sewn up the bottom, put what would you say, a band around here, put in a cord, and then the fun part is on the other side, we've got some Sashiko stars. So in essence, what this is it's a really wonderful way of upcycling old shirts that you can no longer use. It's a fabulous way of creating a gift bag, which you can either give with the gift or it can be returned and recycled, reused for more gift giving. And above all, it's really great because it gives you a chance to practice your Sashiko stitching on it as well with these really fun, simple star circle shapes. So let's change camera angles and I'll show you how to make it. It's so super quick. It's so easy. I did it all by hand. You could use a sewing machine if you wish. And it took me a couple of hours. So the more you do it, the faster it becomes. So you could whip a few of these up for Christmas or the holiday season.
So the first thing we need to do is, if there's a pocket on the front of the shirt, we need to very carefully unpick that from the front. And that's because we're kind of going to be cutting right through the middle of where that pocket is, and I can use that for a later project. So this is something that you want to be really careful with when you are unpicking, because it can be very easy to accidentally put a hole in the shirt. And that's why I like to use the rounded end of the quick unpick, and that just prevents the sharper end from accidentally going through the fabric and putting a hole in it where you don't want it to go. So then what we want to do is cut off the bottom half of the shirt, the part that we're going to use for making the reusable bag. And I'm drawing a straight line from underneath one side of the underarms and across to the other side. I'm using a water-soluble marker and just creating a light line so that the pen isn't dragging on the fabric. Using a sharp pair of scissors, we cut along the line.
Next, with the Gutermann thread, which I like to use because it's quilting, so it's nice to work with hand stitching, and it's a nice weight. Not to mention it's 100% cotton, which I really like as well. I'm going to hand stitch using a whip stitch all the way along here just to join the front and the back. So in essence, we're making a tube of fabric using the shirt. Also a few anchor stitches here. I've also got a knot in the end of my thread as well. But a few anchor stitches means it just isn't going to accidentally go through the fabric. All the buttons have already been done up, so they are helping to hold the shirt in place whilst I'm going to be stitching. And then with my left hand or non-dominant hand, I'm just lifting that up so that I can come in and do whip stitches. Now, of course, you may prefer to use a sewing machine, but I enjoy the process of sitting still and stitching.
how I like to do this is I go across and then down underneath and pull it up. And that means I get these tiny little stitches here that you can hardly see. And then I'll stitch all the way to the end. And finishing with a few anchor knots again, or anchor stitches. Pulling my needle into the back of the work. So the next thing is to sew our bottom seams together. I'm going to sew these on the inside. So that means I'd like to turn my fabric inside out and pin it in place so that the seams line up. And the back is just slightly larger than the front, but that's okay. I'm just going to stitch that all the way to the end there. So now what I'll be doing is using that same thread, the quilting cotton, 100% cotton. I'm going to do a back stitch all the way along here. And again, if you prefer to sew this using a sewing machine, by all means do so. And I'm using this seam as a guideline for where I would like my own stitching to go. So I'm not stitching on the seam because that would be pretty tricky trying to stitch through those many layers. I'm just doing it to the side there. Another option you have is to cut this seam off. I'm following the design of the shirt, so it's got a little bit of a curve, and that's okay. But if you would rather have a flat bottom sack, then all you need to do is cut that little bit off. Just this little bit here. And the reason why I'm hand stitching using a back stitch is because it's just that little bit stronger. It creates a nice strength, and it's less likely to undo as well because of the forward and backward motion of the stitch. And again, finishing with a few anchor stitches so that it doesn't come undone easily. The next thing we do is we're going to iron over, say, 1/4 or a 1/2 inch, and then we're going to measure over 1.5 inches to 1 3/4. If you're working in metric, that's say about 1/2 centimetre, and this is about 3.5 centimetres, and I'm going to come around and whip stitch this band into place. What we're doing is creating a hem, and also at the same time creating a space for where we can put a bit of cord or tie. What I'm going to do is remove this button so that where this buttonhole is where the cord is going to slip in and slip out of. So a couple of anchor stitches. And then a tiny little stitch that goes onto the front of the fabric. Then I'm picking up the back bit. And again, if you would like to sew this by machine, by all means do so. One of the reasons I like doing it by hand, because it is a little bit slower, just means I have a little bit more control on how the fabric is sitting and where my needle and stitches go. That's how it looks on the right side of the fabric, and that's the reverse. Anchor it down with a few stitches. And a little twist knot. So our next step is to very carefully remove this button. And if we can, this excess thread, and this is going to be the hole in which our ribbon or cord is going to thread through. Having the pin on it just makes it that little bit easier to thread through. And you want your rope cord to be the same
width or dimension as the top opening of the bag that you're creating. Sometimes I find it easier to bring the pin over here again and then kind of work my way backwards so that I can find the same space. To pull it out of. There we go. And I'm going to attach this to this whilst I'm pulling it all out so that I don't lose ends in the process. And tie. Keep wrapping our thread through a number of times, and this creates a nice thick knot, which theoretically should stop that from slipping through our buttonhole. And same again on the other end. So create our knot and then wrap it round once, twice. We'll do it 3 times for good luck. There, like so. So now we've got our cord, which is the closure for our bag. And now we can move on to the fun part, where we're decorating our bag with some Sashiko stitches. So I've turned the bag over and I've got the buttons on one side, which I'm going to leave as a feature by themselves. And that's also the side where the cord comes out. So on the other side, this is the side I would like to do the Sashiko stitch. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find some different circular things to use as templates, because these are going to be the outline guide for my circular stars that I'm stitching. Then what I'm going to do is, using a fabric marker, I'm working with a friction pen because they give you a nice fine line, they disappear with heat, and you can also wash them away. So we've got one circle there. We'll have a smaller one down here a bit. And we'll have another one here. So we've got like a series of 3. And I think I'm going to use the inside of the circle again. So I'm just kind of smoothing out the fabric underneath and just tracing the inside circle there. So the next step is drawing out some straight lines so that we know where our stitches need to go. So of course, you don't need to do this, but I always find that it's helpful. And the first thing we'd like to do is just kind of do a rough estimate as to where you think that center is on your circles. And then we're just going to draw some lines running through the center. So these ones here are probably about 1.5 centimeters, half an inch distance from one another. And this is just something that I'm drawing just by eye rather than measuring out. Again, if you like to measure things out, then by all means do so. So we're going to do this for all of our circles. So when we're working with heat pens, or a heat sensitive pen I should say, something to be mindful of is if you don't wash your fabric afterwards, even if you have ironed it, sometimes the marks can reappear onto the fabric, particularly in cold weather. So it is always a good idea to, after you've ironed them, to wash them, and that just means that any residue will disappear. So now we've got our Christmas style decorations drawn up, and I'm going to work with a Sashiko thread. And the reason I like to work with Sashiko thread is because it has a nice weight. It's not too fine, not too thick. But of course, use whatever you have at home. If you have embroidery thread, then I would recommend working with 4 strands of the cotton. And pearl cotton number 8 is also a good thickness too. So when we're doing our stitching of these designs today, things we need to think of are how we approach these center areas. So with all of these, we don't want to stitch over where these lines meet. This is one of the rules of the moyozashi stitches or patterns within Sashiko. So I'm going to put just a dot here using a water-soluble marker as a reminder that I don't want to stitch through those. And the other thing too is I find for best results, we want to keep our first stitch consistent. So I'm drawing another circle around here, and that means that I'd like my first stitch around the center to fit within this circle, and that's going to be what creates that uniformity when we're looking at these patterns. So tying a knot in the end, and we're going to stitch this in like a radial fashion, meaning I'll stitch across here, then I come across, stitch across here, come across, stitch across here, until we fill in all of our lines. Starting on the outside, notice that I'm holding the needle horizontal and still in my dominant hand, and the non-dominant hand is the one that is putting the fabric onto the needle. So I'm up to the center here. I want to make sure where this blue line is, I leave a space. Then there's going to be a stitch here. I come up the other side, go down the other side and pull it through. So I'm actually going to pull it through at this point, just so I can stop and have a look and see how it looks. When we're doing our stitching, it's always important to run your fingers along the stitching in the direction of the needle, and this just prevents any the fabric from gathering. Sorry, I'm just looking at this, making sure that my stitches are following the right lines, which they are. So I'm happy with that. So I'm going to keep on going to the very end. Pulling it through, not too tight, running my finger over it, and then put the needle down in through here and come up over here. So there's going to be a bit of a travelling thread on the back of the fabric, not too much. And then we're going to do the same process again. When I'm doing this, I'm keeping my stitches a similar length, and I can always come back in and look at the length of them on my needle, and they're looking pretty good and pretty consistent. Might actually make this one just slightly longer. And then we're going to finish this off with a knot on the back. And then we're going to do the same process that we have for this one on these other two, here and here. Now that we've got all of our stitching done, the next thing is to think about how we're going to remove our fabric markers. So I always think it's best to remove the water-soluble markers first, and I'll do that by squirting it with the spray from the iron, and then I'll come back and I'll iron over the top of these. It's also something that if you wanted to, you could also just put straight into the washing machine, and that means that the blue marks, the water-soluble marks, will disappear along with any of the heat sensitive pen as well.